Appreciate your attendance. I will, in order to honor your time, I'm going to start right at the 3:30 mark. And as you can see, the topic is student accessibility and accommodations. And you'll see various, I'll go through the beginning stages of it, and we'll talk about the various assessment portals and accommodations and supports within them. Oops. So to get started, what we're going to do is just housekeeping, so to speak, Zoom. Some of you are probably become master Zoomers at this time. First thing we're gonna do is get started is select the participants tab on that black control bar on your screen. Hover over your name, select rename, type in your name, the school where you're at and the grade level you teach, and just kind of helps us create sense of community. And also note, this meeting is going to be recorded. You should see a little screen pop up on your screen in front of you. Regarding audio, please remain muted unless you can unmute yourself by clicking unmute in the lower left-hand corner of the Zoom call. If you do not have a microphone, you don't have to use audio, obviously. And we do enjoy seeing each of you on the Zoom call. And like I said, seeing each other's video and that like facial cues creates a sense of community. If you are not comfortable doing so, or video, as we all know, sometimes negatively impacts your bandwidth, go ahead, turn off your video in that lower left-hand corner of the Zoom call. You have any questions throughout the course of today's webinar, you're encouraged to click on the chat. And we have assessment team, unit team here. We're here to help answer your questions. So, to get started, the objective, what are we here for? So the objective of this 1 hour session is going to be looking at familiarizing you with the terms accommodations and accessibility, with a focus on that 3-tiered approach to meeting all student needs. And then once we do that, we'll do a broad overview of that. Then we're going to look at provide a practical how-to walkthrough on accessing individual student test settings for all the portals within the statewide assessments. And this is going to include the following portals: the Montana Testing Portal, or TIDE, sometimes known as TIDE, you may refer to it as TIDE, the MSAA system, Pearson Next for ACT, and then the DRC for the Access or WIDA test. And I want to start kind of by looking at just the basis, the grounding, the foundation, underpinning of this session, if you will, reading that needs-based selection of test settings section within the 2021 MONCAS Policies and Procedures Handbook. And there it states that the selection of accessibility tools, i.e. in this case, universal tools, designated supports and accommodations, or test settings, is looking at a systematic database process made by educators familiar with individual student needs. So for when you're talking about students being served with English learner plans, IEPs, or 504s, support should be discussed at planning meetings. The supports and accommodations that are provided on these state assessments must be familiar to the student and match those that are provided during classroom instruction and assessments throughout the school year. And students, parents, guardians, families should be knowledgeable about the supports and accommodations planned for their student to ensure that everybody's aware of the conditions under which the child will participate in any assessment. And then each vendor-owned test system collects the test settings so every child can meaningfully participate in statewide assessments. That's kind of the overview, if you will, of the objective of why we're here. That's what we're looking at. We're going to go from there. So again, starting at kind of a broad brush stroke. To avoid any confusion here, let's start with the definition of 4 key terms. Number 1 being students with disabilities. These are students who are going to have an IEP or a 504 that will make them eligible for services via accommodations. And the second lighter gray you see is English learners. There is a persistent, albeit false, narrative sometimes out there that labels an English learner as a student with a disability. An English learner is someone whose native language is anything other than English, or someone where a language other than English has had an impact on the student's level of academic English language proficiency. Student whose native language is not English does not have a learning disability. Rather, the student has a language barrier needs supports in order to participate with academic content. And then the next distinction we have is English learners with disabilities, which means these are English learners which also have an IEP or a 504 plan that make them available for services via accommodations. And then finally, you have general education students eligible for accessibility tools who are not identified as a student with a disability or as an English learner. And then when we look at thinking about accessibility, the terms accommodations and accessibility are often, I feel, intermixed, confused with each other. And maybe this graphic perhaps best describes the differences here. The left panel shows you equality, where all students receive a riser, but only 2 of the 3 can see over the fence. That middle panel shows accommodations, which in essence means that some aspect of a system, in this case the risers, have been modified to meet the needs of a specific individual or group. And then the right panel shows accessibility and captures the idea of creating an inclusive environment for all students. Now, there will always be a need for accommodations in various systems. The concept of minimizing systemic barriers for the good of all students is the focus of accessibility and inclusion in this session on ensuring that meaningful participation for all kids. So you kind of look at this graphic, shows that shift in thinking that includes providing accommodations for students receiving special education services and a 3-tiered approach to accessibility needs for all students. And you may go, wait a minute, you said 3-tiered approach, what are you talking about? And there you have it. This is the visual for the 3-tiered approach. This is outlined in this slide here. It talks about universal features, designated supports, and accommodations. And we're going to walk through each one of these tiers, starting with universal features. These are accessibility tools available to all students who would benefit from them. Within all the statewide assessment portals, all the tools within the 3 tiers are either embedded, which means they are digitally provided within the platform of the website, or they are non-embedded, which translates these tools being provided at the local or district level. And then universal features can be used for instruction via interim assessments if available, or during participation in statewide assessments. And then finally, remember, just because the universal features are available to all students to make the assessment more accessible does not necessarily mean they should be turned on for all students. Some students are going to find these distracting. Example of that is you may have a highlighter. Now you may well know that student A does not do well with a highlighting option on an assessment or any feature for that matter. So highlighter may not be the best, meeting the best needs of that student. In short, use your own local discretion when selecting that individual student test settings. And then we're going to jump to the next feature here, which is designated features. This is that middle tier of accessibility tools. They are specific support needs as determined by the student, family, and team of educators who support the student. The underlying philosophy around utilizing the designated supports as an accessibility feature should be guided by how daily instruction looks for this specific student. Are the available designated support tools something the student already uses in a regular classroom instructional setting? If the answer is yes, then the designated support should be turned on for this student. The idea behind all of this is to ensure that the student has the same supports when participating in a statewide assessment as they do during classroom instruction time. And this ensures meaningful participation while increasing the validity and reliability of score reports. And since the designated supports are accessibility features, the student does not need an IEP or a 504 plan to qualify for any of the designated features. And then the final tier, i.e. the 3rd tier, is the accommodations tools. Accommodations can constitute changes in procedures or materials which ensures equitable access to the assessment that doesn't change the test itself. An IEP or a 504 must require the specific accommodation in order to be utilized. So this is kind of an overview of when we talk about three-tiered approach to student supports, accessibility, and accommodation. And I just want to show you this graphic on the 5-step decision-making process on accessibility and accommodation features across statewide assessments. You look at the top there, that dark gray bar. Step 1 begins with the expectation that all students work towards grade level standards. Step 2 emphasizes the importance of learning about the various accessibility tools available to students and how they can support that student towards meeting the Montana content standards. And then step 3 in the yellow focuses on identifying supports for both instruction and assessments. And then step 4, going down to the 7 o'clock bar, involves the administration or utilization of the supports during instruction and statewide assessments. And then finally, the final step 5 at 10 o'clock is the reflection piece on evaluating the use of those reports. So it's a continuous process there of looking at different supports. So that's a broad brush overview of accommodations and accessibility features within statewide assessments. I'm going to shift and address another component here, which is statewide alternate assessments. Let's look at the qualifications for a student to be eligible for an alternate assessment. A student with an IEP would utilize the accommodations within that 3-tiered approach to accessibility. In short, what this means is an IEP or a 504 plan does not mean a student qualifies for an alternate assessment. Students with severe cognitive disabilities who have an IEP, they require substantial adjustments to the general curriculum in the form of a modified curriculum. Their learning objectives and outcomes focus on functional application and require direct and extensive instruction, are students who qualify for an alternate assessment. And keep in mind, this assessment, an alternate assessment, looks and is administered very differently than the general education, with or without accommodations. The alternative assessments are administered in a one-on-one setting with various supports and accommodations available. And keep in mind that the decision to move a special education student to an alternate assessment has significant implications for the path that a student will take in their K-12 school career. It means the student is not able to participate in the general education curriculum, even when provided with accommodations. A student who participates in this alternate assessment, as I said earlier, requires a modified curriculum. Now, what are these alternate assessments? If you look at this map here, kind of this graph, if you will, the ELA and math alternate assessment is called the multi-state alternate assessment, oftentimes referred to as MSAA, applies to students in grades 3, 8, and 11. In short, it's the alternate assessment for students for general education assessment, Smarter Balance, and the ACT. The alternate for the Montana Science Assessment is the alternate Montana Science Assessment for grades 5, 8, and 11. And keep in mind, it's when I created this, I did not include Montana Science on the far left and ACT, because the Montana Science General, and that was a mistake and oversight on my part that I just picked up on now. So I apologize for that. The Montana Science and ACT covers that 11th grade. Montana Science covers 5 and 8. Alternate Montana Science covers grades 5, 8, and 11. And then you have the alternate for the WIDA Access is the Access Alt assessment across all grade levels. So what I'm going to do is, before we jump into the practical how-to, there's a Zoom poll that's going to come up on your screen. If you've never engaged in a Zoom poll, it's pretty straightforward. It's just going to pop up And it's going to ask you 2 questions. And just go ahead and answer those 2 questions to the best of your ability. Give it another 30 seconds. It's been up for a minute. I'll give you 30 seconds for any of those who want to complete it. We have 17 completed, so we're getting really close. Ten more seconds. Yeah, so it is fair to say that these results is overwhelming, over an 80% proficiency on this, right? Some aspects of a curricular materials that has been modified being the key operative word here, to meet the needs of a specific individual group of students, as outlined in their IEP or 504 plan. This is an accommodation. And then creating an inclusive environment to ensure meaningful participation for all students. This is accessibility. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. And we are now going to jump into more the practical aspect of, okay, you've provided 30,000 foot view of this. How does it look like? What does it look like in my portal, so to speak? And we're going to shift to a how-to format with a brief overview of kind of how to set accommodations and supports within each one of the statewide assessment portals. Now there's many of you in the crowd, so for different learning styles, I'm going to offer something to you to meet your individual learning style. If what I'm going to offer doesn't meet your style, please don't feel obligated to use it right away. For those of you who want to use it, please do. What I encourage you to do either way is write down any questions you have for each portal or assessment as we address these. And at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A version of this. For those of you who have 2 screens, you want to capture your questions in real time instead of writing down your questions. Feel free to access what has been created for you as a Padlet that has been created for you. A link will come up in the chat momentarily where you just click on it and it will take you to a site where the topics are listed up on top with the different portals assessments. And then you can just list your questions below that. That is that's all it is. If you only have 1 screen, you do not want the distraction of another site, simply write down your questions as the link will be provided to you again at the end of the session. So we are going to start, and that link should be coming through pretty quickly. There we go. That is the link should any of you decide to use it. We're going to start with that Montana testing portal, sometimes referred to as TIDE, which houses the math, the ELA, the science, and the alternate science assessments. So yes, these student settings, however you set them, apply for these. This is the portal for those 4 assessments. Now, all student test setting as it relates to accommodations and accessibility features have to be turned on at the local level within that TIDE portal. So for math and ELA assessments, there is a tool designed to allow educators to check that designated supports and accommodations are entered correctly into the TIDE portal. And this tool is known as that Individual Student Assessment Accessibility Profile, which is a mouthful. Nobody ever refers to it as that. We simply refer to it as the ISAP tool. And the overall goal of using the ISAP process and the ISAP tool is to make sure that students have a comfortable testing experience that allows them to Again, it's the key word here, meaningfully participate in statewide assessments. This is a great first step tool to use to make sure that individual students have their needs met. So some of you, and I want to jump over to this test setting, some of you probably heard of student test settings being rolled over from last year. So let me explain what happened and what that means. In response to the challenges that have been brought on by the school districts this year, the OPI rolled over all student supports and accommodations from last year into this year's TIDE portal. What this means is that any student settings the district created for a student last year, i.e. the spring of 2020, these settings are rolled over into TIDE for 2021. Districts should not assume that a student's accommodations or supports are already set for them, but should make sure that all student settings correctly reflect the individual student's needs. I get this question quite a bit. Note, there is no such thing as accommodations or supports being automatically set for students in TIDE. That would be a violation of FERPA. When students are uploaded into TIDE, the only thing we here at the assessment unit can see is, do they have an IEP or do they not? This means that the accommodations options are available to that student if they have an IEP in TIDE. But if they're not turned on, if the accommodations or supports are not turned on at the local level, the student will not have any supports or accommodations. So when I refer to a rollover from last year's setting, what I'm really saying is that whatever the settings were for that student the previous year, which is 2020, which had to be done at the local level, is mirrored in this year's TIDE portal. So to set individual student settings, you log into the Montana testing portal and access TIDE. On the left-hand side of this screen here, you're going to see the preparing for testing panel. Should be familiar, kind of that orange green if you open it up. You're going to want to click on that drop-down menu under test settings and select view, edit, export test settings. Now, if you're traveling through here and you're scribbling down notes and you are going way too fast, guy, this is not going to work for me. Keep in mind, this is recorded. It will be available for you to pause, record, review within the next few days. And you can always reach out to us via email. We can provide you with this slide deck as well. When you go to view, edit, export test settings, it's going to open a window where you can search by students or by specific supports and accommodations. In this screenshot, you'll be looking at a student list for the school. After you select the search button from the previous screenshot, it's going to take you to a page that looks like the one here. To review that individual student, you're going to see that, I call it a pencil icon. It's a green pencil icon that has a link to it. Click on that guy. What it does is going to open a window that looks at that individual student's test settings. Note in TIDE, students have universal supports, which are accessibility features available to all students. There are designated supports available, as well as available to students is determined by the student's educational support team. Do not require an IEP or 504. Finally, there are accommodations available, but accessing the accommodations requires that the student has to be identified at the local level, i.e. in Infinite Campus or Power School as it's uploaded to AIM, as having either an IEP or a 504 plan. As I mentioned earlier, turning on either accommodations or accessibility supports needs to be done at the local level. In short, the current bi-weekly student uploads do not upload student settings. We pull the information from AIM and can only see whether the student has an IEP, a 504, or not. If a student is identified as having either an IEP or a 504 plan, this activates the ability to turn on accommodations. Doesn't turn them on, it just allows the ability to turn them on. Otherwise, accommodations are not available to students. And if you have a large number of students, what I showed you was kind of you can go through each individual student and do that. Now, if you're coming from a larger district and you're saying, yeah, that's cool, but we're not going to do that. set by set. It's going to take too long. You actually can do test settings upload test settings in an Excel file. And if you go back to the preparing for testing panel, we started this a little earlier with, you want to select test settings option instead of the view, edit, export test settings option. And this is going to take you to a window that resembles the screenshot on the right side of the screen, where you can download a template that's going to walk you through a step-by-step completion process. Your Excel file is going to look similar to the one here on the screen with options. And once it is completed and ready to upload, you're going to go back to the page where you pull the template from, upload your file using the browse or drag and drop features, selecting next, which is going to download the file into Tide, and set individual student settings as determined by the file you created. So if there's any questions on that, scribble them down, or if you have your Padlet open, you got two screens open, go in there, jot down your thoughts, your comments, questions. And I'll give you just a little bit of debrief time on that, because we're going to shift to stay with math and ELA, but we're going to shift to the alternate assessments next. So the alternate, we're going to switch to the ELA and math alternate assessment portal, referred to as MSAA. Keep in mind the MSAA's tiered approach is an inverted pyramid that has built-in test design features to make it accessible to students with severe cognitive disabilities. The MSAA assessment is a multi-stage test, which means that there are 2 stages to the test itself. All students take a similar version of Form 1, and their performance on that determines whether they take Form A, B, or C, Form 2 test. And then the accessibility features are available to all students who qualify for an alternate assessment, and include supports for both a computer or paper version of the test. And any accommodation required by the student must be included in their IEP. And I don't want this slide to become overwhelming. And I'm giving it to you of an idea about I want to give you an idea of the number of available accessibility supports and accommodations within that MSAA portal. And for clarity, within this portal, any embedded accessibility feature is built in the test itself and does not need turning on, like you saw in the Tide portal. Again, like any accessibility features that are embedded are readily available to use during the test without being turned on at all before the test. All accommodations must be completed before you start the test in that accommodations before testing tab, which if you go through the training modules, it'll walk you through that step by step. All accommodations listed in the student's IEP should be selected. If you're going to wonder, what do you mean by accessing this before testing tab? And note that when you log into your MSAA portal account after February 22nd, i.e. Monday, you must complete, if you're a test administrator, you must complete the training modules and complete the quiz with an 80% proficiency before being given access to any testing material. And this training, part of that training is it's going to methodically walk you through all the steps, how to prepare for, administer, and after testing responsibilities. So that is the quick version of MSAA. And I am now going to turn it over to Chris Noel, who is our science specialist on alternate Montana science assessment. Now keep in mind, what I talked about in Tide refers to math, ELA, science, and alternate science. And here Chris is going to give you more details about the specific alternate science. So Chris, you bet.
Thank you, Dwayne. And I want to reiterate what Dwayne just said. I am not going to go back into detail about the settings portion of this. I'm just going to highlight some things that are unique about the AMSA specifically. So next slide. Thank you. The very first most important thing that I want to say about the AMSA this year is that this year is a field test. And what that means is that we will be We will be looking at what data is available in order to potentially provide back to the field some feedback around the assessment, but we will not have formalized reporting or accountability this year. And to me, that's really important to name before we get too deep into talking about what makes the AMSA similar to or different from SMARTER and MSAA, is just to remember that this year it will be very different because all items are field test items on these assessments, and there is no accountability or reporting at the individual student level, which makes not a reason to not get our settings right, but just to know that we're kind of in a year where we'll be learning a lot of things, and we might have some things that we learn through the process this year, and we want to make sure we kind of stay open to that field test mindset. We do use the TIDE portal, the same as Smarter Balance and the Montana Science Assessment. Dwayne did a great job walking through all of that stuff. Dwayne mentioned that the MSAA is a stage adaptive test. That AMSA is a computer adaptive test at the item level. And so this year, as students engage with that will not be functioning the way that it ultimately will function when we are doing full reporting, but you will kind of see that item level adaptation that looks and feels similar to SMARTER. There is a fixed form available for the alternate Montana Science Assessment as well. Next slide. Similar to or building off of what Dwayne shared around the difference between just what we have available in terms of accessibility that every student can access versus those things that are accommodations and really require that IEP or 504. I'm going to show you an individual item, but you can kind of get the idea that these are very similar. We've done what we can to minimize the differences in the accessibility features and the accommodations, even though we have different vendors for the math and English alternate assessment than we have for the science assessment. And then of course, across subject areas, what an accommodation is can be variable. In some cases, something that I could allow a student to use as an accessibility feature on a science test would not be allowable on a math test, because that would be at that accommodation level of really changing the expectation, changing what I'm able to say that a student knows and is able to do. And so I put these up on the screen. They're the things that are accessible in TIDE, and they are very much the pieces that you'll want to verify whether that rollover is correct and whether every student has the correct accessibility features turned on, or has that IEP or 504 plan on record for those accommodations to come through. Next slide. I put a link here, and I'm actually, hopefully I copied it a long time ago. I'm going to paste it in the chat, and hopefully it's still, nope, it's not still the link that I have. I will put the link into the chat to where the training tests are. And I think because these assessments are new this year, really spending some time engaging with those training tests as an STC, as a SPED director, as a teacher, as a whatever your role is really valuable, because it will help in thinking about the importance of those different accessibility and accommodation features. So this is a sample of, I pulled this out of one of the practice tests. They are not super secured. You can get into them without logging in. And so I chose to paste this onto our slide. But you can see that we present students with often an image to start with, very, very limited text. In every case, you can see that little ear there. That ear there indicates that a child can click there and have it played for them. That ear is present for all text as a baseline in the alternate assessment. And you can see that all of the answer choices are very short, typically 1 or 2 word answer choices. And so as we think about getting into this and field testing it and getting a feel for how this test will function for our learners and which of those accessibility and accommodation features are most important this year, I really do encourage people to kind of take some time engaging with a handful of items to make sure you have a sense of kind of how this test will feel for the student, as it is different than our other assessments. And I think my last slide, I wanted to present those are kind of where I see the 3 big ideas around how the AMSA is similar or different to SMARTER and MSA, but I wanted to give a chance to let you guys ask questions, since with a new test that's field testing this year, it's hard to predict what your questions might be. So does anybody have any questions about the AMSA or the science test in general? Okay, Dwayne, I don't see anybody unmuting and I don't see anything in the chat. So if anybody has a question, how long does the MSA take? Cindy, I've asked our test vendor that question, and I've had a hard time getting a really clear answer to that. First of all, because it's a new test, and second, because it's the field test. And I think that when I ask that question, they're very ready to give me an answer about what we anticipate for the first operational version of the test, but the field test itself will be a little bit shorter. So I will continue to push on them to get a firm number on that, and make sure that we publish that when we have it. But at this time, the answer that I've gotten is that it's going to be shorter than we're used to, because it's just a field test. And the sign language accommodation, I don't want to give you the wrong answer. I think that is a non-embedded support, and that means that it would be something that you are doing in the classroom, but I just want to double check that so I don't give you an incorrect statement there.
Can we come to that at the end of this,
Yep,
Chris?
we can come back. Yep.
We'll let Chris so you'll have time, Chris, to review that. And then make sure if you have it, you can put it in chat, surely, but we'll definitely address it again at the end. And Marcy, I'm going to shift it over to you. We're going to shift topics a little bit here and go to accessibility and accommodation student supports within the ACT. So Marcy is our assessment specialist, managing the ACT contract and working with many of you who have no ACT, know Marcy. So Marcy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dwayne. So yes, we'll talk a little bit about the online mode, administration mode for the ACT. If you want to go to that slide, perfect. So most of you will likely be using the paper again this year. We do have a few schools who have signed up for online, and we do have some schools who have selected a date in the online window in case it's needed for reasons related to COVID or those types of things. So there really are no test settings, nothing to set up for paper testing aside from just your local arrangements as needed. So today's webinar, we're going to discuss the online mode of administering the ACT with writing. So there are two different sites or portals for administering the ACT with writing online. One is for the student and one is for the test coordinator. So the two sites do talk to each other. So when the test coordinator sets up sessions in Pearson Access Next or PA Next, the session will populate for the student in the student's test nav account, provided the student is assigned to the correct test. So there is no test coordinator user account in the test nav platform. That's only for the student. And likewise, or the other direction, I should say, there is no student account in PA Next. That's only for test coordinators. So next slide, Dwayne. So prior to testing, the test coordinator is going to create test sessions within the PA Next portal. So according to the ACT Quick Start Guide for preparing online testing, you're going to want to create these sessions 2 to 5 business days before testing. So I'm going to share, see if Chantel can share the link to that Quick Start Guide for preparing online sessions for you. That is a great resource. It's a self-guided, it's similar to a PowerPoint, but you self-guide through it. It takes you step by step through how to set up test sessions within PA Next. So there are some tasks that have to be completed prior to setting up the sessions. And that guide does have a timeline starting at 4 weeks prior to testing. So with today's webinar focusing on setting up supports and accommodations, I'm not going to dive into all those tasks because those are really more related to being sure your systems are set up for online testing. But if you are planning to use the online testing mode, especially if you're planning to use that beginning the week of March 23rd, you should be looking at starting those preparation tasks next week. So the test sessions created in the Pearson Next site, you're going to do that under the testing tab. So we have up to this point this year, we've mostly been using the setup tab for your tasks in Pearson Access. So now we're going to move into that testing tab. And under this testing tab, you're going to select sessions from that drop-down list. And then from the drop-down, you're going to select create edit sessions. You can see from the screenshots there. And next slide, Dwayne. So there's several other steps to follow to create a session for online testing. Again, I'm not going to dive into each of those steps since we're just focusing on setting up those accommodations and supports. But that guide that I put in the chat, that walks you through all of that. So today I just wanted to focus on setting up the sessions for students with accommodations. So as you create sessions, there are required fields to be completed, and those are shown on the slide with the red boxes. One of the fields you complete before assigning students to the sessions is the session name field, and that's identified by the red arrow there. Test sessions are groups of students who will receive the same verbal instructions, work on the same test, take breaks at the same time. So if you have a group of, say, 50 students and say 10 of them have a timing code accommodation, you may be testing in groups of 10. So maybe you'll have standard room 1, standard room 2, that you'll put 10 students each into those rooms. So when you're creating those sessions, you want to be sure to use a name that indicates the student group that will be assigned to that session, so that later when you start assigning students, you'll be able to identify which session they belong in. So in this example, I created a session called Timing Code 3 because I have 3 or 4 students that have that approved accommodation. So in the online portal, the majority of the only accommodations are timing accommodations and text to speech. Those are the only accommodations that are available online. So all the other accommodations are only paper-based. So the majority of accommodations approved are timing code. And so those are the ones you're most often going to be setting up for within the online system. And next slide, Dwayne. So once those sessions have been created, then you follow the steps in the guide that I shared earlier to assign the students to the sessions. You'll do that. You'll indicate the timing code during that session setup when you set those up. And the test nav system is automatically going to time the tests unless it's a session for a timing 6 or timing 7 code. Timing 6 and timing 7 do have to be timed manually by the room supervisor or the proctor, the test coordinator, but all the rest of them will be timed by the computer, provided you've set those up correctly in that when you set up that session. There is a report within Pearson Access Next that you can run to assist in ensuring your students are assigned to the correct test sessions. In the ACT guides, it typically lists this as a step after you create the sessions, but I would recommend that you run that report and have it available before you set up the session, so you're sure to create a session for each group of students you might have. Now you can go back and delete sessions or edit them if you need to, but if you have that report in front of you, it might save you some time in setting up those sessions. And that report is located in, like I said, the Pearson Access Next, under the Reports tab and under Operational Reports from the dropdown. And on the next screen, you check the box in front of Students and Registrations in the Report Categories list. And from the list on the right that will populate after you check that box, you select Accommodations and Supports Roster. And this gives you an Excel sheet with all the approved accommodation students on your student list. And that can help you in creating those online test sessions. So really, that's really it for settings in PA Next. And there is another self-paced tutorial I wanted to share in the chat. Chantel, it's managing online test sessions in PA Next. This one is similar to the first one I shared, but it goes deeper into how to actually manage the online sessions all the way through testing, and not just before for setting up like we've talked about here. And then I think there was one other one I wanted to share in there, Chantel. How to create and assign test sessions tutorial. That's the other one. All 3 of those resources are going to be really helpful in helping you set up those test sessions, especially with the online being new for most of our schools this year. So, so yeah, that is it for ACT. Any questions about the ACT session setup?
I'm just going to add, if you do have questions, could you put it in that Padlet, write it down? We're going to spend the next probably 10 minutes. We'll try to find 5 minutes at the end to address those questions if we can. I want to provide time for
Perfect.
the next access for ELS, which is English language learners. And I do want to provide time to Jacob Bartow, who is our English language learner specialist, and give him the opportunity to make sure that he can address what accommodations around this, as well as the alternate for ELS. So Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dwayne. Access for ELS, many of you are probably aware, is the annual English language proficiency assessment that we give to our English learner students in Montana to assess their progress year after year. And thank you. For those of you who have not yet finished up access testing, make sure to keep in mind the administrative considerations and universal tools that are explained in WIDA's accessibility and accommodations supplement. So this is a pretty lengthy document. It's available for download in the WIDA secure portal in the download library. It walks through, like Dwayne was saying, this sort of three-tiered approach, right? So there's universal design, then there are administrative considerations and universal tools. And these are supports that are available to all students, regardless of IEP or 504 status, to help them successfully navigate the access test. Some examples include alternate headsets or microphones for student comfort, working with a familiar test administrator to ease any students' anxieties they might have, allowing additional breaks during sessions, verbal praise or reinforcement, as well as redirection to keep students on task, built in. And then as regards universal tools, there are built-in audio aids, color contrast for improved visibility, a highlighter to aid students with reading comprehension, a magnification tool for students with any vision difficulties. These are all little tools that are built into the software. And so there are icons basically that you can click on to activate these tools, and you can help students find them. So like Dwayne was saying at the beginning, remember, these are not accommodations, right? These are universal supports. These can be toggled on or off or activated for all students. But the supplement pictured here on the screen, this accessibility and accommodation supplement, does also contain guidance on available accommodations for students with IEPs or 504 plans. So when it comes to setting up those accommodations for those students, they will need to be done on a case-by-case basis in WIDA AMS. So to see your roster of registered students, you go to Student Management, and then click Manage Students. Enter the administration. So this would be Montana Access for ELS 2020, 2021. And then select your district and your school, and you can pull up a list of students. And then you'll need to go through and manually enter those accommodations as specified in a student's IEP plan or 504 plan by clicking on the icon next to their name and pulling up this edit student box that you see on the screen here. And this is an example student that I created. And so it just shows you what this looks like. Basically, there is a list of accommodations on the left and then a list of boxes. And you can click there and then activate the accommodations for students. Make sure that you do this prior to beginning test administration, because once accommodations are activated in here and saved, then when the student logs into the software what's the word I want, secure browser software, then those accommodations will be activated there because they'll be associated with the student's unique login information. So each student has to have these accommodations activated prior to logging into the test. Cool. Go to the next slide. And then Access for ELS testing window does close next Friday. So if you've not yet finished testing, we encourage you to make every effort to do so. Please ensure that all tests are complete by next Friday, and then that all test materials are returned to DRC by Wednesday, March 3rd, so that central scoring can begin. Any materials returned after March 3rd will trigger a testing incident in the Modcast application. But then also remember that EL education and EL support, they continue into spring assessments. So during your preparations, as Dwayne pointed out before, please ensure that your EL students have appropriate language supports in place for their math, English language arts, and science assessments. You can consult the accessibility guides for Smarter Balance MSA and ACT to see which supports would most benefit your EL students on those other assessments. And then I'm just going to take a minute to talk about alternate access for ELS, because this alternate test is given entirely on paper and it's administered one-on-one between a test administrator and a student. So it does not have accommodations in the way that these other computer-based tests do that can be toggled on and off. Instead, there's an array of what we pretty much call administrative considerations, right? That invite students to demonstrate their language abilities in ways that align with their unique needs and their modes of communication. So for example, students can use individualized instructional supports during the test. Basically, any practices that are employed during everyday instruction to meet individual student needs are permitted during the test. Students may use dedicated augmentative and alternative communication systems, as long as those are, again, designated in their IEPs and used in everyday communication and instruction. TAs may provide additional cues if a student answers incorrectly or does not provide an answer to the initial question. And this is all laid out in the training for alternate access as well. There are 3 different cues that test administrators can give for each question as they prompt students to answer. And then during the speaking portion, there are additional questions, and administrators can ask additional questions to give students additional opportunities to speak and demonstrate their language abilities. And then finally, in the writing section, the last section of the test administrator may model writing tasks and guide students into the task by providing examples. But that's about all I have. Don't see any questions in the Padlet at the time or in the chat box. So then I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you, Dwayne.
Thank you, Jacob. What I'm going to do is just give you a quick broad overview, and then we're going to go to questions. So as a recap here, let's take a quick look at what we've addressed in this webinar. Look at the 3-tiered approach as being a central component of accessibility to meet and accommodations to meet all student needs. We looked at 4 different portals that house the 6 required statewide assessments. TIDE, located in the Montana Testing Portal, houses math, ELA, science, and alternate science assessments. We looked at the MSAA portal, math and ELA alternate assessments, followed by the ACT. The final portal was a DRC, or AM, that houses that access test for English learners, WIDA. Rather than putting in your breakout rooms, what I'm going to do is ask you to access that Padlet link, which is the last chat. If you open chat, it's right there. And I am going to just flip my screen here a little bit, share with you that Padlet so we can all look at the same. We're looking at the same thing, and start answering any questions you may have. And I'm assuming you're seeing the meaningful participation Padlet. If you are not, somebody just give me a feel free to let me know.
We can
So,
find Dwayne.
thank you. So designated supports, just for clarification, students who are deemed to need designated supports by classroom teachers are allowed to use any of the designated supports that you listed in the Smarter Balance, the math ELA assessments, color contrast. So any that are listed as designated supports are made by a local decision. In essence, student, family, IEP team, or sorry, I take that back. Student, family, educator team, teacher, and that includes teachers. If that is something the student has used consistently in the classroom, yes, that is what designated supports are for. They do not need an IEP or a 504 plan. EL question. Our school has one student who is an EL. There is no EL program at our school. Can she still qualify for the supports for EL students? In short, the answer is, if they're an EL student, of course, they need those supports. But Jacob, do you have anything you want to address this specific question?
I'm sorry, my internet just froze.
So to repeat, the question is, our school has one student who is an EL. There is no EL program at our school. Can she still qualify for the supports for EL students? And the end of the day is yes, all students, no matter how many students there are, or how many, if there's one EL, if there's 20 ELs or 100 ELs, these supports are there for ELs regardless. Is there anything you want to add to that, Jacob?
No, I would just echo what you said. Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries, thank you. And then I have Hutterite students who are not considered EL by OPI. English is their second language though. Can I use the supports? Jacob.
That's interesting. Are they not considered EL because they have exited from EL status and tested proficient? In that case, if they've tested proficient and have been exited from EL status, then that's interesting. We have we categorize many Hutterite students as English learners. So this might actually be something that you want to reach out to me individually about, because this may be a misunderstanding. If English is their second language and their home language survey indicates that they speak another language at home, and then they should be screened as potential English learners. And then if they're identified as English learners, they should receive those supports. The only time I would say that a student might not qualify for EL supports on an assessment is if they've tested proficient in English, in academic English, through the WIDA assessment that we provide.
Thank you. And Jacob, do you mind, maybe Jacob, put your email address there in chat, and that way you can see it in chat and reach out to Jacob for that question and continue this conversation. I'm assuming the MSAA question, you see the answer right below it. That was me typing. Chris, do you have any insight on the science question, which is for sign language accommodation? Is that on screen or a person in the classroom?
I found it. My mute button was hidden. I answered it on the in the chat. I just pasted the information from the TAM. Typically in the TAM it says embedded or not embedded, and this, it does not say embedded or not embedded in what's written there, but it does say that it is on the screen. So I did reach out to Amelia to double check that that is an embedded support that the school does not need to make any arrangements for.
Excellent. Thank you. And to honor your time, guys, what I want to do is make sure you do have the accounts coming in, or not the accounts. What am I trying to say here? Getting you the Give me a minute. Let me just share my screen. I'm trying to do two things at once and it's not going as well as I would have hoped. But there, you should be back on the slide deck. And if you look at the slide deck, you would see, this accessibility, Montana accessibility site. If you want to throw that in the chat as well, Chantel, this is an excellent resource. This is a detailed version of what we just did in the last hour. And then, in order to get renewal units, there's a session evaluation form. I believe Marcy's going to put that in chat, follow up here. Make sure you complete that. That is what prompts you to receive renewal units. I appreciate, thanks in advance for your feedback. Really appreciate it. Thank you for attending the webinar. I know we're right at the top. We're 1 minute over. Honor your time. I'm going to let anybody log off if they want to. We as a team will stay on if there are any additional questions and you have the time to stay on. If there's anything that was not addressed, please feel free to stay on. I can't help myself. How does the dog look up in the top right-hand corner of the screen?
I was going to say that I like him.
Couldn't help myself. I thought a little comic relief at the end, right?
Little yoga dog.
He's cute.
So I'm assuming we've provided a minute and a half, 2 minutes now on questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lock this down and go from there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.